Hello crafty friends, it's Jess from jesscrafts.com. Today I'm here with the Hero Arts September 2017 My Monthly Hero Kit. As you probably know, this kit is a little bit older. I'm recording this video in October, way after the kit came out, and in fact there's a whole other kit available that has since sold out and I've received and have to make a video for, etc., or would like to make a video for. But I had some other things going on and could not get to the video until now, and so I hope that this is still useful to those of you who have the kit and are interested in some ideas. And if you were interested in the kit and were not able to purchase one as it is sold out, I am going to be selling most of my kit. The stamps, dyes, inks, and whatever I have left over, but I am going to use a bit of the paper, some of the embellishments that come with the kit, and so those won't be included. But stay tuned for the end if you're interested. That backer sheet with the sunflowers, I am going to make use of it in making the cards because I see no reason to throw that out as trash since it is a pretty and usable part of the kit, and I'm also going to use the packaging in terms of those little raffia type pieces that came with it. They're plastic though, and I'll talk more about them as I use them. To get started, I wanted to label the inks that came with the kit because they aren't labeled in any way. Hero Arts does list in the description of the kit what colors are included, but it doesn't, there's no indicator on the little plastic cubes which is which. And so I wanted to try to figure that out before I started, so that way when I grabbed a little ink cube, I would know what color it's coming out, and it would be helpful if I was going to add them to my collection, which in the end I chose not to because I had most of them to know which one was which. So I'm going to not only create a little swatch here to help me, but then I am going to use my label maker and I am going to label the sides of the ink cubes. And so if you do purchase the kit, you will of course get the labeled ink cubes because I did do that before I decided not to keep them. However, here I was looking in my collection and noticing that, I had quite a few of them, so I wasn't going to bother to make my traditional ink swatches for them. However, I also noticed, and this is why I wound up labeling them, is if you don't have any labels on the black part, the ink pads don't necessarily look that different. You might accidentally put the wrong lid back on them, and I guess that's not so much problematic as long as the bottom is labeled, but like nothing was labeled. The tops aren't labeled, the bottoms aren't labeled. If you're working and opening a couple of ink pads at the same time, and I realize not everyone opens a bunch of ink pads at the same time, but when you're doing stamp layering, I find that more likely to be true. Like when I'm working with my Distress Oxide inks, a lot of times I do have a couple of lids off at one time, for instance, and so I felt like it'd be helpful to label it. And then even the traditional Hero Arts ink cubes, like here's the butter bar, it is labeled on the white top, but I thought it would be helpful to label the black bottom. And so I'm going to go through and do that to a lot of my ink cubes, and so I just thought it would be useful to share with you that idea in case you are a fan of the Hero Arts ink cubes, which, ink cubes in general. I like having the ink cubes. I like having lots of colors in those small packages, and so I think it was nice to find a way to make them even a little bit more useful to me. So to get started, I wanted to try stamping the stamps from the kit with the Hero Arts inks that were included to kind of see what effects I could get. There are only 2 oranges and they're pretty close in color. There's only 1 yellow, and then the pumpkin pie, honestly, I guess it's kind of supposed to be an orangey color, but it really reads brown to me. And and I believe there's no green at all, but I'm going to pull in some green, although I might be mistaken. But trying to layer the particular images with the handful of ink cubes they gave you, it's not going to be possible in the sense that you're going to need a couple greens, a couple oranges, and that's fine. I don't expect them to include that many colors of ink in a kit. It would be really difficult. But I just want to suggest that you probably will want to supplement it. I think that I got stuck here at the beginning because sometimes I want to stick really close to the kit. I thought, well, the kit provides ink, so I should really try to do most of my stamping with the ink in the kit. But that was making the whole experience a lot less enjoyable to me. I was finding that I had to use a stamp positioning tool, and I had to stamp the images many, many times before I could get a really good impression. And I know that if you condition your stamps, they will start to stamp better over time. So since these are brand new stamps, that is part of what's going on here. You could condition them by stamping them perhaps in Versamark. You could take a file to them and just kind of give them a bit more grit. And there's various things you could do. Or you could stamp them in Distress Oxide inks, which have a pigment property, and pigment inks give better solid stamping impressions. So ultimately, and there are other pigments out there, however, I don't like them as much because they don't dry as well. I have found that Distress Oxide inks dry really, really well, but they give you that full coverage look of pigment inks, and they also blend really, really well. So to me, Distress Oxide inks are like 1,000% worth the investment. I cannot overstate how much I enjoy having them, and if I could only have one kind of ink, it would easily be Distress Oxide inks, because you can sentiment stamp with them, you can solid stamp with them, you can do lots of fun techniques with them. So, if somebody said you have to get rid of every ink but one, what kind of ink, I would have to keep my Distress Oxides. They are just simply the most versatile. As I was trying to layer the stamps, I was using this reference guide, but I personally was still finding it difficult. I don't have a lot of experience with layering stamps. It's not as much my style. I personally really like to stamp in color images. I really like critter images. I'm not much of a flora and fauna kind of person. Fauna is animals. But sorry, I'm a little bit rambly today. I don't as much like the realistic look. I like cutesy, cartoony animals. That's just kind of my personal style. I think that cards made with stamps like this are gorgeous, and when other people make them, I really appreciate them. But it's just, not as much a personal style thing. However, I am trying to, learn how to use this set and make some pretty cards with it. I just don't have as much experience as some people who really do love those flower layering sets. And so they might be able to give you better tips, but it was mostly kind of error and, learning from mistakes. Also, what I wanted to point out about dye inks versus the Distress Oxide inks or pigment inks. Dye inks will stain your stamps. That's fine. It shows that it's a good ink. There's no problem with your stamps being stained. However, some people don't like that, or it might be more difficult to tell how well inked your stamp is, etc., etc. So that's one reason that Distress Oxide ink also may work out or way better as an option for some people. And you can, again, just completely clean them off because they are water reactive. For the pumpkin here, I'm actually sticking to just the colors from the kit. I am using the orange soda, the tangerine, and then the pumpkin pie. I didn't feel like it gave a super realistic look. And then there for the sunflower, I also tried to use just the kit colors, and I'm using the butter bar, the pumpkin pie, and the cup of joe. And it gave me a much browner sort of sunflower than I might otherwise choose. And you were also kind of limited because then when you went to stamp the center, you had to use the same two colors of ink, which doesn't look bad, but just kind of makes the overall sunflower really dark. So here, after I stamped a bunch of those, and I'm going to cut them out with the coordinating dies, and I'm going to use them in other parts of the video, I am just trying to stamp a bunch right now as I learn about the kit and see what I like working with, because I'm going to have to use these images a lot. Here is where I decide to try my Distress Oxide inks. I thought, well, I do eventually want to actually finish 10 cards with this kit and enjoy them and share it with you, so I may as well switch to an ink that I'm a little bit more comfortable using, and I think that gives faster results. Because you see there, I still stamped it twice, but I found that the Distress Oxide inks gave faster results, and later on in the video, I am going to just stamp impressions with blocks of the Distress Oxide ink, and they're going to do a wonderful job. So they're my vote. But anyway, I'm using the antique linen for the biggest part of the flower, for the, the most base. And then I'm moving on to fossilized amber. And in the end, I might switch it up and do a different order, or I might, like if I was going to keep stamping them in the future, it might not be the ideal combination, but those were kind of the yellows that I had to work with. You might prefer to stamp with a darker color first. Generally, you want to go lightest to darkest with these though. But the nice thing about pigment inks is they will layer and sit on top of each other. So you could possibly stamp with a lighter on top of a darker and still see it, and that might be another reason you want to try them. Also, the Tombow sand eraser works a lot better with pigment inks than it does with dye inks. I know they say, oh, you could just sand off any dye ink that you get where you don't want it, but because dye ink sinks into the paper, I find that really difficult to do. I really feel like I wind up tearing my paper more often. And with the Distress Oxide inks, I can lift up ink splotches that go where I don't want them to without doing much damage to my paper. Here I am using the Twisted Citron for the green, and I found that it was a lot darker than I wanted, so I'm going to switch over to peeled paint in the future, I believe, and then go with a darker green for the layering on top. But I do think that the Twisted Citron could work. It's just a very bright green, so something to consider. Here, for this particular one, I do think I used Twisted Citron and then peeled paint for the darker, but in future flowers, I kind of mix it up because I wasn't sure. However, I will say that I liked the Twisted Citron underneath a lot better once I stamped the darker color on top. So once some of that really bright green was covered with the darker green, I liked the look. So I definitely encourage you to just kind of experiment with whatever inks you have and try a bunch of looks. And remember, as I kind of in some ways personally had a hard time, that the stamps may be a little bit tricky to stamp with at first, but over time they will get better. They will get kind of conditioned and you will start getting better and faster results. But here I'm also stamping the Sending You with Distress Oxide inks, and it's giving a really nice impression even on sentiment stamps, which regular distress inks, traditional distress inks, are not known for their stamping capabilities. So I think some people might hesitate to stamp sentiments or such with them, but they really do a great job. And I know that I've been bragging about them or whatever, promoting them the whole time or whatever. It's just, it works. That's what I'm seeing here. So I'm going to pull in colors from the flower into my sentiments too, because I really want these to, I want to make use of the colored ink a lot since I am doing that layered stamping with the colored inks. Anyway, I have them all out, so I want to take advantage. Here I'm showing how to use the raffia from the kit. So now we're back to actually making cards, guys. Sorry all that stamping took a long time, but I thought it was important to talk about the way the stamps work because that's such a huge part of this kit. But if you already came up with a good way, hopefully you've kind of fast forwarded a little bit, or I should have warned you before. So I'm pulling apart the plastic raffia, and that's what it reminds me of, but that's usually paper, so I don't know if you call it the same thing. But this plastic green wrapping stuff, I'm pulling it apart and I am gluing it down, and I'm using a strong adhesive and covering the area completely with the adhesive just because it is a little bit flimsy and light, so if you only put a little adhesive, it may not stick quite the way you want. And also there's these layers and folds, and so if some of them are sort of flapping up and others not, it doesn't quite give the same finished look. So I found that a nice good even coat of adhesive was best. And then to be really gentle as you worked with it, because the plastic does have a tendency to rip. And even as you're applying adhesive to the back, continue to be careful because it can start pulling up the plastic, ripping the edges, and not give the most smooth finished look. I'm just putting a little bit of green on each of the sides, and then I'm taking that sunflower that I was just stamping. I trimmed off the edges a little bit, and I'm going to center it on there so that it has a bit of a green border created by the green plastic packaging. And I thought that was a fun use of the packaging to give some texture and interest, which you might not be able to easily achieve with paper. Next up, I created a similar panel. I actually had stamped 2 at the same time. If you noticed while I was kind of rambling about how much I love Distress Oxide inks, I was stamping 2 of each. And so this time I put it on the vellum, the yellowy orange vellum from the kit, and I'm going to add adhesive behind that panel, but not behind the vellum. And I again wanted to pull in some of that packaging. And since I had already kind of spread it out and created strips like that, I thought, well, I should think of a different fun way to use the packaging. So here I'm going to keep it as a sort of string of sorts. And I'm going to just sort of line the edge of the panel. And this time, instead of centering the panel, I put the panel a bit off to the side. As you can see, the cards are very, very similar to each other. There's the yellow borders instead of the green borders, and it's just kind of like, well, this one's off to the side, and this one's with vellum, and, you know, similar, but I think that part of my thought process there was you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you make a card, for one, that the cards will look, you know, different enough that nobody will think, oh, they're copies, but you see, they're very similar. However, you know, sometimes it's nice to just, like, if you like the pretty look of a card, just change it up a tiny bit and you'll still enjoy it. So I also needed to create 10 cards for you guys, so that kind of sped me up. These are, those ones I just showed you were the original ones that I made from using the Hero Arts inks, and I was able to get nice impressions over time by stamping them, you know, a couple times on my MISTI. And I die cut them all with the coordinating dies from the kit, and I'm going to use the coordinating dies in other ways as well. To cut out other images that I'll stamp later off screen, so you don't have to watch me stamp forever. But I wanted to just make some quick cards with those since I'd already made them, even though they weren't my favorite. Like, I didn't like the super brown sunflowers. But here I am creating a piece of orange paper using the inks in the kit. Of course, you know, if you have orange cardstock, just go for it. You don't have to do this step. But I wanted to show that you can make use of the inks in several different ways by adding color directly to your cards, and I'll do that with ink swiping later too, which you guys have seen me do a million times if you've watched other Hero Arts videos. But I like to create cardstock with my inks as well, so that everything coordinates perfectly. I don't have to dig through my stash for the same color of orange, and, you know, I don't have to, like, sometimes the oranges, you think, oh, they're very similar, but then one is like more of a neon or something like that. So just making my own can be sometimes easier and actually faster than digging through, because it doesn't really take too much time to swipe a bit of ink on the edges. I'm going to die cut that out with a frame. The frame is from Gina Marie Designs, and I will try to find it and link it, but it's one that I try not to use as much on videos because it is a little bit harder to find. Here I'm also going to stamp the sentiment in one of the coordinating Hero Arts inks. Again, since we are using so much color on these, I thought, you know, don't just stamp black sentiments, really keep those fall colors, really keep everything matchy-matchy coordinating. But I found that I wanted to stamp with my MISTI because I wasn't sure I'd get a great impression the first time, and I'd rather not, you know, mess up a card by getting an imperfect sentiment. So, especially since I have that stamp positioning tool available. Then, to add a bit of interest, I've framed up the sentiment and the pumpkin, and I'm just going to put a little bit of foam tape behind them so that they have a bit of dimension, since it is such a clean and simple card. And I did lean towards clean and simple cards for this particular 10 cards, 1 kit video, mostly because just stamping the images took so long, just getting the sunflowers, and I realized, like, if you colored an image with Copic markers, that would take a long time as well. But I just, you know, felt like I had spent so much time stamping and getting a little bit frustrated by that I wanted to make some more clean and simple cards. Anyway, here I'm doing ink swiping, which, again, you've seen me do before. I'm not trying to pretend this is an original idea. I've done this several times. They gave me ink cubes, so I'm sure you're not surprised. But it's fun to do, and it creates a quick and simple card. It adds a very, like, fun painter sort of look because you get the brush edges. But I will recommend, and I always say the same thing, be sure to start in the center as you do your ink swiping. Swipe from the center out to both sides to get a more organic look on the sides. If you swipe from one side to the other, one side, the side you start on tends to be really smooth, and the side that you end on has the, fun brush stroke look. And I wanted to avoid that. So you can see here I also tried covering a whole card with the ink swipe stripes, but I didn't like the way that it turned out, and I think that I wind up not using that panel at all, to be honest. And instead I kind of try like, well, do I like the pumpkin on the ink swipes? Do I like the sunflower on the ink stripes? And I eventually decided to go with the sunflower, partly because I felt like it popped off the ink stripes more. The orange kind of blended in a bit, but the green is really going to pop off those yellows and oranges. And then I was sure that when I added the yellow flower, to make it mostly in the brown area so it didn't blend into the background. And I'm also going to stamp a sentiment. And this is a piece of white cardstock that's just under the size of a card base. All my cards today are A2 size cards. They're all created with Recollections 110-pound cardstock from Michaels. It's one of my favorite cardstocks to work with because it does a nice job, but also because it is easy to come by and relatively cheap because you can use a good coupon on it. If you ever get one of those like 60% off coupons, great time to just stock up on some cardstock because, it has that $15 price tag, but once you put the coupon, it's a great deal. And I don't have to use as expensive cardstock, and I can save that money for, purchasing stamps and such. So here I'm stamping. When you see me stamping from a stamp block the sentiments, I'm almost always using Distress Oxide inks because I trust Distress Oxide inks. So like when I stamped that hello on that last card, it was a Distress Oxide ink because I trust that it's going to stamp well the first time because of its pigment qualities. And there were slight imperfections here and there as I stamped, but that wasn't the ink, that was me not putting full pressure down, and that definitely factors in. You do want to stamp well. You have to be a good stamper, I guess, in that sense. But here I am trying to create a background for my pumpkin. I really like that You Are Gorgeous sentiment. I liked that a lot of the sentiments in this kit, between the pretty flower layering that I saw people achieve and the really fun sentiments. This was actually one of my favorite stamp sets that I've seen. It's just that I found personally I didn't like using layering stamps, even though I like the look that they achieve. So I just used the Fossilized Amber to stamp the You Are Gorgeous, except for the main sentiment. I stamped that in one of the browns. I honestly cannot remember which brown is which with the Distress Oxide inks. It could be the Walnut stain, but I wanted to create a clear focal point sentiment, but then use the rest to sort of fade into the background. And I thought the yellow would not provide much contrast to the orange, so it wouldn't sort of pop out against the orange. Then, when I had die cut that frame out of the orange ink, I thought, well, why am I going to waste this inside that could have been also colored orange? And so I finished inking it up orange, and I even actually pulled in some of the Distress Oxide orange ink, the Spiced Marmalade, I believe it was, and just helped fill it out to create an orange panel. But because it had the Distress Oxide ink mixed with the Hero Arts ink, it created a little bit of interest and variation. It wasn't just like a solid piece of orange. And then I'm going to, again, stamp with my Distress Oxide inks for the sentiment. One thing I do want to note about that is if the Distress Oxide ink underneath or any of the inks underneath are still wet, it doesn't give as crisp of an impression. So I recommend making sure that you're completely dry before you try to stamp something that you want nice and crisp on top of it, like a sentiment. If they're wet, they kind of start to do a little bit more of a blending thing. Also, to attach things like those leaves, I am using a dot adhesive from scrapbook.com because the dot adhesive will only stick to parts of it because there's just little dots of adhesive. We're using ATG gun, it gives like a, piece of tape essentially coming out of the gun. And whereas the dots will only, kind of conform around it, and all the extra dots that aren't on your piece will stick to your scrap paper or your mat or whatever underneath. And so it allows you to very quickly and easily glue down odd shaped things or small things. Because when I was experimenting with the Distress Oxide inks, I found that I could honestly stamp layer with a block, which scared me after starting. Because when I started and the first time I tried to stamp these down, they did not give good impressions trying to use dye ink. It really wasn't working. But the Distress Oxide inks did, and so I thought, well, since I know that I can actually stamp with a stamp block and them, I can do something like I've seen a lot of people do. You know, I saw a lot of the design team samples, or I don't know, whoever makes the samples, and they were doing some really cool things with them, but I was like, I don't know how they're doing that because it takes me so long to get one good image. But maybe they're using pigment inks, or maybe they know how to use dye inks better than I do. However, I eventually felt comfortable going right to paper and right with a stamp block. I did still have some trouble lining up, and I think that that actually has more to do with the fact that I'm trying to keep my head out of the camera room. Like, you know, I don't want to put my head directly over it because then I would be blocking my project. So it does make it a little bit trickier to line up in that instance, but I am using the 2 different colors of brown. I believe the ones that I chose were the Walnut Stain and the Vintage Photo. One is definitely a little bit more of a cooler brown and one is a warmer brown. I'm again using the Antique Linen as the layer, and then I'm using the Fossilized Amber on top. As you can see, the Fossilized Amber really brightens it up, and which might not be obvious here because I'm going super fast as I am trying to get through this video in a reasonable amount of time, is I am not really bothering to line up the sunflower. I don't really care in this instance because it's such a small part of the sunflower that if they don't line up perfectly, you don't really notice it and it still creates a beautiful look. And this might be fun for somebody who likes the look of stamp layering but doesn't like the sort of tediousness of trying to layer it up every time. And I'm not matching any of the layers perfectly and I'm still getting a really pretty result in my opinion. And I enjoyed using the stamps much more in this fashion because it wasn't so much like, oh my gosh, I'm ruining it. And the same thing as I go in here with my 3rd layer, and this time I believe I am pulling in the Spiced Marmalade, but it might be the Wild Honey. Again, just use whatever color combinations work for you. I'm just not lining it up. I'm just pulling it, you know, in wherever it seems to fit, and it looks fine. I do kind of look at little things like if I have a super long piece sticking out in a super short part of the sunflower, you know, pay a little bit of attention to that, but not much. And one thing that I haven't really used yet is there's actually a little layering bee in the set, and again, kind of intimidated me because I was like, I'm having a hard enough time layering large stamps. I don't know how I'm going to do layering these small stamps. But since with this card I've already kind of given in and embraced the idea of imperfection, I thought, you know, to heck with it. I'm going to stamp the little bees. And so I did, and they are not perfect by any means, but I kind of created that theme with this card. So, and I used a yellow and a brown for the bees. Next up, I wanted to use that sunflower background packaging. The packaging on the other side does have the stamp layering directions, and so you might not want to use it. You might want to keep those directions. However, I honestly did not find those directions to provide much help in terms of, other than just seeing how the final product looked, but it doesn't really help me to line them up. So, you know, I decided to use the packaging, and I wanted to tone it down a bit because the background was pretty bold. So I decided to layer the yellow-orange vellum from the kit over that background piece, but I did leave a little border on the side so it would kind of poke out and look like an extra layer. And here I'm only going to put adhesive behind the parts that are covered with cardstock. so that way you don't see the vellum poking out through the adhesive. I really don't like that look. I don't like, you know, where you can see the obvious tape lines. In the kit, there was some paper that appears white here on the screen, but actually had some slight color to it. It's sort of a slight off-white. And I am using it at times, but I think it's very hard to distinguish when I am. I think that it does give a nice look, though, to have that slightly less than white appearance, because it does coordinate better with the sort of fall colors. A cream is a little bit more fall to me, but I am putting them all in the bright white cardstock background, so I could use white just as easily in the place of any of those. So then this is all I had left from the packaging, and I was like, am I really going to be able to pull another card out of it? Do I want to just throw it out? Because there is that My Monthly Hero piece in the top. And that's when I got the idea of doing the opposite. So, sort of the opposite. I before made the piece of vellum smaller than the piece of background paper, and I thought, well, I could, you know, mix it up and make the piece of background paper smaller than the vellum, and it would create a similar look of layer, but allow me to take advantage of what might otherwise be considered trash. So I'm going to use that for my next card. The thing about the Hero Arts kits is they are an amazing value. You cannot take that away from them. For the amount of stuff you get, it is a steal. I don't know how they do it. I love their kits, and I appreciate their level of customer service and what they provide. So even when a kit may not be my favorite, I'm always able to make plenty of cards with it. But they do not include pattern paper or much paper at all. I personally like that. I'm totally fine with that. I don't need a lot of pattern paper. I have a lot. I also know how to make my own patterns and all that. But I'm going to still take advantage of what they do provide. Like, there's no reason to throw out that stuff to me. And you know from, if you've watched some of my other videos with the Hero Arts kits, I take advantage and I'm always using those. And I think I'll continue because they do include some fun images on them. And it's a fun challenge too, to like turn garbage into supplies, even though none of us need more supplies, really. I don't. I'm sure plenty of people are getting started too, but I just find that like a vast majority of us, like, we could probably throw out that ribbon and we'd be totally fine. But then also, like, it's kind of fun to figure out how to use that little bit of ribbon. So here I am again using the packaging, using the garbage, and I am tying it around the card. It looked so pretty when they tied it around my kit, so why aren't I gonna, you know, use the same pretty ribbon and get the same effect? So I just tied it in a knot, and I wrapped it all the way around the card. I find that to be a little bit easier, and then I'm going to take advantage and flare out the edges, since that is a kind of ribbon that flares out at the edges. I'm going to pull it, flare it out, and then trim it down to the size that I like. I've again put a sunflower behind it. It gives me room to put the adhesive. And then if I'm going to stamp a sentiment, I'm going to want to use the Stays-On ink there in the corner. I only have it in black, unfortunately. I think I would have liked to have it in brown in this instance, just because I liked really keeping everything in those fall tones. I haven't used a lot of black in this kit, and I think I decided not to even stamp a sentiment for that reason. Then here is my last card. And this is the part where I got a little crazy, because I was like, you know what? I've made like a whole bunch of yellow sunflowers at this point, and I know sunflowers don't come in a lot of colors. But I said, oh well, I'm just going to make pink sunflowers and I'm going to have fun with it. So these are my pink and red sunflowers that I am pairing with the gold sunflower embellishments from the kit, and recognizing that they don't make sense and enjoying it anyway. So I stamped those again with Distress Oxide inks. I think I used the Worn Lipstick and Picked Raspberry, and then 2 reds, not sure which ones. This is the Picked Raspberry that I'm stamping the sentiment in though, which is the darker color of pink. And I thought, and then I stamped using the red, I think it's Candied Apple, the red for the flower. So again, just using a lot of bright colors, even with my stamping, or using a lot of color. And then to glue on these little embellishments, they are very, not bumpy, they have unevenness to them. So I'm going to glue them down by putting some foam dots behind them. So rather than trying to glue them down with a liquid glue because they're uneven, I'm going to just put a little bit of foam behind each one, and it's going to lay pretty flat on the card even with the foam, just because there is such a little like divot in the back behind the center of the sunflower. But it's going to just glue down so much easier, and I don't have to worry about like gobs of glue coming out the edges. But then the flowers I did just glue down with glue because that's what I had on hand. Anyway, now my 10 cards are done. And if you want to see still pictures, head to my blog and you can just look at a picture of each one to kind of go over them again. But I hope that this gave you some ideas. I hope that you're not sick of hearing about how much I love Distress Oxide inks. Anyway, I am selling what's left of my kit. Here you can see what's left of my kit. I am asking for $35, including shipping in the US. And I know that that's about the price of the kit, but honestly, you know, what they provide is more than the price. And I need to also recover shipping costs, which are going to cost even in the US quite a, $6 or $7 to ship, usually. Anyway, $35, including shipping, no extra shipping charges. And I'm going to accept it through PayPal. If you're interested in the kit, please email me at jesmoyer@gmail.com. I'll include that in the video description, and I'll do it first come first serve just because that's easiest, and I'm just going to do US only so that I don't have to worry about the shipping charges. Sorry. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're interested in more crafting tutorials, be sure to subscribe to my channel. I will be sharing more Hero Arts kits. I am a subscriber, and I thank you so much for watching and taking the time, and I hope that this was helpful in some way. Have an awesome day. Bye.